The sun hung mercilessly over the Burkina Faso savanna like a copper shield, its rays piercing through the acacia trees and casting long, dancing shadows across the endless expanse of golden grass. It was the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and dance, creating mirages that played tricks on weary eyes. The dry season had stretched on for months, leaving the earth cracked and thirsting, its surface resembling a vast puzzle of drought-etched scars. President Ibrahim Traoré had seen many such days during his time leading Burkina Faso, but something about this particular afternoon felt different. Perhaps it was the unusual stillness in the air, or the way the birds seemed to have abandoned their usual chatter, leaving behind an eerie quiet that pressed against the eardrums like cotton. As his convoy rumbled along the dusty road that connected the capital to the remote villages of the eastern provinces, he gazed out through the bulletproof glass of his armored vehicle, his mind heavy with the weight of leadership. At 35, Traoré had already weathered political storms that would have broken older men. His face, carved by determination and marked by the responsibilities of steering a nation through turbulent times, had become a symbol of hope for millions of Africans who saw in him a new generation of leadership. His eyes, dark and penetrating, carried the intensity of someone who had witnessed both the beauty and brutality of power. Today, he was returning from a diplomatic mission in the eastern region, where he had been negotiating peace agreements with community leaders affected by recent insurgent activities. The presidential convoy consisted of 12 vehicles, a carefully orchestrated procession of security and state power. At the front, 2 armored reconnaissance vehicles swept the road for potential threats, their occupants scanning the horizon through advanced surveillance equipment. Behind them rolled the president's heavily fortified limousine, flanked by additional security vehicles filled with elite soldiers from the Presidential Security Regiment. The rear was brought up by support vehicles carrying communications equipment, medical supplies, and a small contingent of national media representatives who documented the president's activities for the public record. Captain Amadou Sankara, head of the president's personal security detail, sat in the front passenger seat of the presidential vehicle, his trained eyes constantly moving across the landscape. A veteran of 15 years in military service, Sankara had protected 3 different presidents through coups, assassination attempts, and civil unrest. His weathered hands rested on his rifle, fingers experienced in the weight and balance of the weapon. He had learned to read the land like a book, to spot danger in the flutter of birds, or the unusual positioning of seemingly innocent objects. "Sir," Sankara spoke into his headset, his voice crisp and professional, "we're approximately 30 kilometers from the capital. Estimated arrival time is 45 minutes. Assuming no delays." His eyes swept the terrain ahead, noting the increasing density of thorn bushes and the way the road curved around a small hill dotted with ancient baobab trees. Traoré nodded, his attention momentarily drawn to a folder of documents that required his review before the next morning's cabinet meeting. The papers detailed agricultural development plans, security briefings from the northern regions, and economic reports that painted a cautiously optimistic picture of the nation's recovery from recent challenges. Yet something nagged at him, an inexplicable sense that this journey would be different from the hundreds of others he had taken since assuming the presidency. In the communications vehicle, journalist Fatima Ouedraogo was reviewing footage she had captured during the day's events. At 28, she had established herself as one of the country's most respected political correspondents, known for her fearless questioning and her ability to capture the human stories behind policy decisions. Her camera equipment was state-of-the-art, capable of broadcasting live to news stations across West Africa and, through satellite uplinks, to international networks. She had covered conflicts in Mali, elections in Ghana, and development initiatives across the Sahel region, but today's diplomatic mission had felt routine until now. "Something's different about this return journey," she murmured to her camera operator. Marcel, a thin man in his 40s whose steady hands and sharp eyes had captured some of the most important moments in recent Burkina Faso history. Marcel nodded, adjusting his equipment and checking the battery levels on their devices. They both had developed an instinct for when ordinary moments were about to become extraordinary. The convoy's radio crackled with routine communications. Eagle 1 to Eagle Base, proceeding along Route 7, no obstacles detected, reported the lead vehicle. The code name Eagle had been chosen for President Traoré after his election, inspired by his reputation for soaring above political turbulence and maintaining a clear vision of the nation's future. As they rounded a bend in the road, the landscape opened up into a vast clearing surrounded by dense clusters of acacia and marula trees. The grass here grew taller, creating a golden sea that swayed gently in the sparse breeze. It was the kind of scenery that had inspired countless poems and songs about the African wilderness, a reminder of the continent's untamed beauty that existed alongside its modern challenges. Suddenly, the lead vehicle's radio burst to life with urgency. Eagle 1 to all units. Movement detected at 2 o'clock. Large animal approaching the road. The convoy began to slow, standard protocol when wildlife was spotted near the route. Encounters with elephants, buffalo, or other large animals were not uncommon in this region, and the security team was trained to handle such situations with patience and caution. But this was no ordinary animal sighting. The first vehicle came to a complete stop, and within seconds, the entire convoy had formed a defensive formation. Soldiers emerged from their vehicles with practiced precision, establishing a perimeter while keeping their weapons lowered but ready. The dust kicked up by the sudden halt created a small cloud that hung in the still air, adding to the dreamlike quality of the moment. President Traoré stepped out of his vehicle, despite the immediate protests of Captain Sankara. "Sir, please remain inside until we assess the situation," the security chief urged. But Traoré raised his hand in a gesture that had become familiar to all who worked with him, a calm but firm indication that his decision was final. "I need to see this for myself," Traoré said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had helped him navigate complex political negotiations. He had always believed that leadership required courage in the face of the unknown, and something about this moment demanded his personal attention. The sight that greeted him was unlike anything he had encountered in his decades of life in Africa. From the tall grass emerged a male lion of magnificent proportions, its mane a rich tapestry of gold and brown that caught the afternoon light like spun metal. The animal was massive, easily weighing over 400 pounds, with shoulders that rippled with muscle beneath its golden coat. Its paws were the size of dinner plates, each step creating small impressions in the dusty earth. What struck everyone present was not the lion's size or beauty, but its behavior. Instead of displaying the typical wariness or aggression that wild animals showed when confronted by humans and vehicles, this majestic creature moved with deliberate purpose. Its golden eyes, usually the embodiment of predatory focus, held something different, an expression that seemed almost human in its complexity. The soldiers raised their weapons, fingers hovering over triggers, training and instinct warring with the surreal nature of what they were witnessing. Sergeant Umaru Diallo, a 20-year veteran of the armed forces, found his hands shaking slightly as he sighted down his rifle barrel. In 2 decades of service, he had faced armed rebels, defended against attacks, and maintained order during civil unrest, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. "Hold your positions," Captain Sankara commanded through his radio, his voice steady despite the unprecedented nature of the situation. "Wait for orders from the president." The lion continued its approach, each step measured and purposeful. When it was approximately 20 meters from the convoy, it stopped. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms, analyzed by wildlife experts, and debated by philosophers and theologians around the world. The great beast lowered itself to the ground, not in the crouch of a predator preparing to spring, but in what could only be described as a bow. Its massive chest touched the earth, its head lowered in a gesture that spoke of supplication rather than submission. A low rumble emerged from its throat, but it was not the threatening growl of a dangerous predator. It was a sound filled with what could only be interpreted as pleading. Fatima Ouedraogo's journalistic instincts overcame her shock. She signaled to Marcel, who began filming immediately, his camera capturing every detail of the unprecedented scene. The live feed began transmitting to their news station, and within minutes, the footage was being shared across international networks. Social media algorithms, programmed to detect unusual content, began pushing the video to users across the globe. President Traoré stood transfixed, his mind racing to process what he was witnessing. His education in political science and his years of experience in governance had not prepared him for this moment of communion with the wild. Yet something in the lion's posture, in the intelligence that shone in its eyes, communicated across the ancient divide between human and beast. The lion's head turned toward a dense thicket of thorny bushes at the edge of the clearing, and it released a soft, chuffing sound, the kind of vocalization that lions use to communicate with their pride members. It was then that the humans heard it, a faint, agonized cry that seemed to emanate from the vegetation. "There's something in those bushes," whispered Dr. Sarah Ndiaye, the medical officer who traveled with the presidential convoy. A trained physician who had worked in rural clinics before joining the presidential staff, she had learned to recognize the sounds of suffering in all its forms. "Something's hurt." The lion turned back to face the humans, and in that moment, a wordless communication passed between species. The great cat's eyes locked with President Traoré's, and in that gaze was a message as clear as any spoken language. "Help her." Captain Sankara moved to block the president's path as Traoré began walking toward the thicket. "Sir, this could be a trap. We don't know what's out there." His training had taught him to suspect every unusual situation, to look for hidden dangers and planned ambushes. But even as he spoke, part of him recognized that what they were experiencing transcended normal security protocols. "Sometimes," "Captain," Traoré replied quietly, "we must trust in something greater than our fears." He continued walking, each step taking him closer to the source of the cries and deeper into a situation that would soon captivate the world's attention. Thorny bushes that lined the edge of the clearing were typical of the savanna ecosystem, hardy plants that had adapted to survive in harsh conditions, their branches armed with sharp spines that could tear flesh and clothing with equal ease. As President Traoré approached, followed cautiously by his security detail, the cries from within the vegetation became more distinct and heartbreaking. Pushing aside the branches with careful hands, they discovered the source of the anguish that had driven the male lion to seek human help. A lioness lay trapped in a cruel snare, her right hind leg caught in the serrated jaws of a steel trap designed by poachers to capture valuable wildlife. The device was a horrific example of human greed transformed into mechanical torture. Spring-loaded steel teeth that had clamped down on the animals, leg with crushing force. The lioness was magnificent in her own right, slightly smaller than her mate but equally powerful. Her coat a lustrous gold marked with the scars of a life lived wild and free. Her breathing was labored, each exhale accompanied by a soft whimper of pain that tore at the hearts of everyone present. Blood had soaked into the earth around the trap, creating a dark stain that spoke of hours of suffering. Dr. Ndiaye immediately moved forward, her medical instincts overriding any fear she might have felt. "The wound is severe," she announced, her voice clinical but tinged with emotion. "The trap has caused significant tissue damage and blood loss. Without immediate treatment, infection will set in within hours." The male lion had followed them to the edge of the thicket, his massive frame casting a shadow over the scene. He paced in tight circles, his distress evident in every movement. Occasionally, he would approach his mate and touch her gently with his muzzle, offering what comfort he could while remaining alert to the humans who had answered his desperate plea for help. President Traoré knelt beside the wounded animal, studying the trap's mechanism with the analytical mind that had served him well in political negotiations. The device was sophisticated in its cruelty, designed to hold its victim without killing immediately, thus preserving the value of the captured animal. Springs and gears worked together to maintain constant pressure, making escape impossible without external intervention. "This is not a simple hunting trap," he observed grimly. "This was placed here by organized poachers, people who profit from the suffering of wildlife." His voice carried a weight of anger that those who knew him recognized as a sign of his deepest moral convictions being engaged. Marcel continued filming, his camera capturing not just the dramatic rescue attempt, but the complex emotions playing across the faces of the humans involved. The footage was now being viewed by hundreds of thousands of people around the world, with viewer numbers climbing exponentially as social media platforms amplified the signal. Comments began flooding the live streams. "This is unbelievable. A lion asking humans for help. That president is risking his life for a wild animal. Faith in humanity restored. This is what real leadership looks like." The trap's release mechanism required tools that the convoy did not carry in their standard equipment. Captain Sankara radioed for bolt cutters and medical supplies to be brought from the support vehicles, while Dr. NDA began assessing what could be done to stabilize the lioness once she was freed. "The blood loss is concerning," she reported. "But if we can stop the bleeding and prevent shock, she has a chance." Her words were spoken quietly, meant for the president's ears, but the sensitive microphones on the media equipment picked up every word, broadcasting them to the growing global audience. As they waited for the tools to arrive, President Traoré found himself in a moment of extraordinary communion with the natural world. The male lion had positioned himself where he could see both his mate and the humans working to help her, his golden eyes moving between them with an intelligence that seemed to acknowledge their efforts. "In all my years," the president said softly, speaking as much to himself as to those around him, "I have negotiated with world leaders, faced down armed militants, and weathered political storms. But I have never felt the weight of responsibility more keenly than I do at this moment." The lioness stirred, lifting her head slightly to look at the humans surrounding her. There was no fear in her gaze, only a weary acceptance and perhaps incredibly a glimmer of hope. The sight of this magnificent predator trusting in human compassion created a moment of profound connection that transcended species barriers. When the bolt cutters finally arrived, the operation to free the lioness began in earnest. The trap's mechanism was more complex than initially apparent, with multiple locking points that had to be disengaged simultaneously. President Traoré worked alongside his security team, his hands steady despite the proximity of two powerful wild animals who could, under different circumstances, pose a mortal threat. The male lion watched every movement with intense concentration, occasionally vocalizing in soft chuffs and rumbles that seemed to encourage both his mate and the humans working to free her. It was as if he understood that these beings, so different from himself, were his mate's only hope for survival. The afternoon sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, painting the savanna in shades of gold and amber that seemed to illuminate the extraordinary scene with an almost ethereal light. The shadows of the acacia trees grew longer, creating a natural amphitheater around the rescue operation that had now captured the attention of millions of viewers worldwide. As President Traoré and his team worked to dismantle the cruel trap, the atmosphere grew thick with tension and hope. The bolt cutters, designed for industrial use, slowly bit through the steel components of the snare, each cut bringing them closer to the moment of liberation. The metallic sounds of their work created a rhythmic counterpoint to the lioness's labored breathing and the soft vocalizations of her mate. Dr. NDA had prepared makeshift medical supplies, using bandages and antiseptic from the convoy's first aid kits. "We'll have one chance to treat the wound before she regains full mobility," she explained to the president. "We need to work quickly once she's free." The global audience watching the live stream had grown to over 10 million viewers, with news networks around the world interrupting regular programming to cover the unprecedented event. Hashtags related to the rescue were trending on every major social media platform. Lion Rescue, Traoré, the Protector, Wildlife, Hero, Love in the Wild, Burkina Faso Miracle. Comments poured in from every continent. "Watching from Tokyo, this is incredible. President Traoré is showing the world what true leadership means. That lion knew exactly who to ask for help. This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." The trap's final locking mechanism proved to be the most challenging, requiring the combined strength of 3 men to compress the springs while the bolt cutters completed their work. President Traoré positioned himself directly next to the lioness's head, speaking to her in calm, soothing tones in both French and Moor. His native language. "Easy, beautiful one," he whispered, his hand hovering just inches from her muzzle. "We're going to free you. Your mate brought us here to help, and we will not fail him." The lioness's eyes focused on his face with an intelligence that seemed to acknowledge his words. Her breathing, while still labored, appeared to steady slightly in response to his calming presence. The male lion, sensing the approaching moment of liberation, began to pace more rapidly, his excitement building alongside his anxiety. "Almost there," announced Sergeant Diallo, who had taken charge of the bolt cutters. "One more cut and the primary spring will release." The moment arrived with the sharp crack of metal under stress. The trap's jaws sprang open, releasing their cruel grip on the lioness's leg. She let out a cry that was part pain, part relief, and began to struggle to rise to her feet. Blood flowed more freely from the wound, but for the first time in hours, her leg was free. The male lion's roar shook the air, a sound so powerful that it seemed to vibrate through the bones of every person present. It was a roar of triumph, of gratitude, of love reclaimed from the jaws of despair. Birds scattered from nearby trees, and even the insects seemed to pause in their evening chorus. Dr. Ndiaye moved swiftly to treat the wound, her medical training taking over despite the surreal circumstances. "The tissue damage is extensive, but the bone appears intact," she reported as she worked to clean and bandage the injury. "She'll need extended care, but she should recover full mobility in time." The lioness allowed the human treatment, her mate standing guard nearby with an alertness that spoke of protective instincts rather than aggression. The trust displayed by both animals was unprecedented, creating a moment that wildlife biologists would study and debate for years to come. As the immediate medical crisis passed, President Traoré stood back to survey the scene. The lioness, though wounded, was now free. Her mate stood beside her, nuzzling her gently while maintaining his vigilant watch over the humans who had answered his desperate plea. The setting sun painted everything in golden light, creating an image that would become iconic in the hours and days to come. "This moment," he said, speaking both to his immediate audience and to the millions watching around the world, "reminds us that courage and compassion know no boundaries. When we see suffering, we must act. When we witness love threatened, we must defend it. These magnificent creatures have taught us something profound about the bonds that unite all living things." The lioness took her first tentative steps since being freed, her movements careful but determined. With each step, her confidence seemed to return, aided by the encouraging presence of her mate. The couple began to move slowly toward the edge of the clearing. But before disappearing into the wilderness, both animals turned back to look at the humans who had saved them. In that moment of mutual acknowledgement, something passed between species, a recognition of shared experience, of love understood across the divide between human and animal consciousness. The male lion approached President Traoré one final time, stopping just beyond arm's reach, and lowered his massive head in what could only be interpreted as a bow of gratitude. The footage of the lion's final bow to President Traoré became one of the most viral videos in internet history, accumulating over 100 million views within the first 24 hours. The image of the majestic predator lowering his head in acknowledgement of human compassion transcended cultural, linguistic, and political boundaries, speaking to something fundamental in the human experience. News anchors struggled to find adequate words to describe what they had witnessed. "In 30 years of broadcasting," said CNN's veteran correspondent, "I have never seen anything that so perfectly captures the potential for harmony between humans and the natural world." The BBC's wildlife expert, Dr. Margaret Ashworth, provided scientific context. "What we witnessed challenges our understanding of animal behavior and cognition. The male lion's ability to seek human help for his mate suggests a level of reasoning and emotional intelligence that science is only beginning to comprehend." Social media exploded with artistic interpretations of the event. Digital artists created stunning renderings of the lion's bow, poets composed verses about love transcending species, and musicians began working on compositions inspired by the encounter. The image became a symbol of hope in a world often divided by conflict and mistrust. But President Traoré understood that the moment's power carried with it tremendous responsibility. As his convoy finally resumed its journey to the capital, he spent the remaining travel time crafting a response that would honor the magnitude of what had occurred while addressing the underlying issues that had created the crisis. Upon arriving at the presidential palace, Traoré found crowds of citizens gathered outside, many holding handmade signs with messages of support and images of lions. The story had reached Burkina Faso through social media and international news coverage, creating a wave of national pride that extended far beyond politics. "Mr. President," called out Aminata Sawadogo, a university student who had traveled from Ouagadougou to join the crowd, "you have shown the world that African leadership means protecting all life, not just human life." That evening, President Traoré addressed the nation and the world in a televised speech that would be remembered as one of the defining moments of his presidency. Standing in his office with the flag of Burkina Faso behind him and images of the day's rescue displayed on screens, he spoke with the gravity of someone who understood the historical significance of recent events. "My fellow Burkinabé, my fellow Africans and citizens of the world," he began, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had marked his interaction with the lions. "Today, in the savannah of our beautiful country, we witnessed something that challenges us to reconsider our relationship with the natural world and with each other." He paused, allowing his words to settle before continuing. "A lion, the king of beasts, humbled himself before humans and asked for our help. He did not see us as enemies or threats, but as potential allies in preserving what he valued most, the life of his mate. In that moment, he taught us that love, courage, and compassion are not uniquely human qualities, but forces that unite all living beings." The speech was broadcast live across Africa and streamed internationally, with simultaneous translations appearing in dozens of languages. Social media platforms saw unprecedented engagement as viewers shared and discussed the president's words. "But we must also acknowledge the darker truth that led to today's miracle," Traoré continued, his tone becoming more serious. "The trap that nearly killed that magnificent lioness was placed there by human hands, motivated by greed and indifferent to suffering. We cannot celebrate today's rescue while ignoring the ongoing threats to wildlife across our continent and our world." He announced the creation of a new wildlife protection initiative, funded by resources that would be redirected from other government programs. "We will establish anti-poaching units equipped with the latest technology. We will create economic alternatives for communities that currently depend on illegal wildlife trade. And we will work with international partners to address the demand for illegal wildlife products that fuels this cruel industry." The announcement was met with overwhelming support both domestically and internationally. Conservation organizations that had been struggling with limited resources suddenly found their phone lines overwhelmed with offers of support and collaboration. Dr. Jane Goodall, the renowned primatologist, released a statement praising President Traoré's leadership. "What we witnessed today was not just a rescue, but a reminder of our shared responsibility to protect the magnificent creatures with whom we share this planet. President Traoré has shown that true leadership means acting with courage and compassion, even in unexpected circumstances." In the weeks following the lion rescue, the event's impact continued to expand in ways that no one could have predicted. The footage had been viewed over 500 million times across various platforms, making it one of the most watched videos of the decade. More importantly, it had catalyzed a global conversation about wildlife conservation, human-animal relationships, and the nature of leadership. Educational institutions around the world began incorporating the story into their curricula. Elementary school children in dozens of countries wrote essays about the brave lion who asked for help and the president who answered. High school students debated the ethical implications of human intervention in wildlife situations. University philosophy departments organized symposiums exploring the consciousness and emotional lives of animals. The economic impact was significant as well. Tourism to Burkina Faso increased dramatically as visitors hoped to catch a glimpse of the famous lions or to experience the landscape where the miracle had occurred. The government established ethical wildlife viewing programs that benefited local communities while providing sustainable alternatives to poaching. Dr. Ndiaye, who had treated the lioness's wounds, became an international spokesperson for wildlife medicine. She was invited to conferences around the world, where she shared not only the technical aspects of the rescue but also the emotional impact of the experience. "When I knelt beside that lioness," she told an audience at the International Wildlife Medicine Conference in Nairobi, "I was not just treating an injured animal. I was participating in a moment of trust between species that challenged everything I thought I knew about the boundaries between human and animal experience." The male lion and his mate, who had been monitored by wildlife researchers since the rescue, became the subjects of an unprecedented longitudinal study. Camera traps placed throughout their territory documented their recovery and their continued behavior toward humans who encountered them in the wild. Remarkably, the pair seemed to have developed a unique relationship with human presence. While they maintained their wild nature and hunting instincts, they showed no fear or aggression toward park rangers and researchers who worked in their territory. Some observers reported that the male lion would actually approach human vehicles and observers, as if checking on their activities, behavior that was virtually unknown in wild lion populations. "They seem to have learned something from that day," observed Dr. Robert Matambo, a wildlife behaviorist from the University of Botswana who had been studying the pride. "The male lion, in particular, shows behaviors that suggest he understands humans can be allies rather than threats. It's unprecedented in the scientific literature." The story also had profound political implications. President Traoré's approval ratings soared to historic levels, not just in Burkina Faso but throughout West Africa. His actions had resonated, with a population tired of leaders who seemed disconnected from the real concerns of ordinary people and the natural world they inhabited. Other African leaders began adopting similar approaches to environmental issues, recognizing that conservation efforts could serve as powerful symbols of responsible leadership. A new generation of politicians emerged across the continent, many citing President Traoré's example as inspiration for their own commitment to environmental protection. International relationships also shifted. Countries that had previously been reluctant to engage with Burkina Faso found themselves eager to establish partnerships, particularly in the areas of conservation and sustainable development. The European Union announced a major conservation funding package specifically for West Africa, while China committed to stricter enforcement of bans on illegal wildlife products. 6 months after the rescue, President Traoré decided to return to the site where the extraordinary encounter had taken place. This time the journey was planned as a formal expedition to establish a new wildlife preserve that would protect the area where the lions lived and ensure that such traps could never again threaten the local wildlife. The expedition included wildlife biologists, conservation experts, and a small media contingent, but President Traoré had insisted that it maintain the respectful, low-impact approach that had characterized his original journey. "We are visitors in their home," he had told the planning committee. "We must behave accordingly." The convoy that made the journey was different from the one that had encountered the lions months earlier. Solar-powered vehicles replaced diesel engines where possible, and the team carried equipment designed for wildlife monitoring and habitat preservation, rather than security and defense. As they approached the familiar clearing, the excitement among the expedition members was palpable. Dr. Ndiaye carried medical supplies in case the lioness required additional treatment, though remote monitoring had suggested that she had made a complete recovery. The research team had equipment that would allow them to establish a permanent monitoring station without disrupting the natural behaviors of the local wildlife. The clearing looked different in the early morning light, with new grass growth and signs that the area had remained a vital part of the local ecosystem. Fresh tracks in the soft earth indicated that various animals continued to use the area as a corridor between feeding and watering sites. Marcel, who had filmed the original encounter, set up his equipment with the same careful precision that had captured the historic moment. "I keep expecting to see them walk out of those trees," he confided to Fatima, who was documenting this return journey for a feature documentary about the ongoing impact of the rescue. They didn't have to wait long. As if summoned by the presence of the humans who had changed their lives, the familiar golden forms emerged from the tall grass. The lioness appeared first, moving with the fluid grace of a fully recovered predator. Her injured leg showed no signs of the trauma it had endured, carrying her weight with complete confidence. Her mate followed, his magnificent mane catching the early morning light just as it had on that dramatic afternoon months earlier. But something about his demeanor was different now. Gone was the desperate urgency that had driven him to seek human help. In its place was a calm confidence, as if he understood that the humans in his territory were not threats but allies. The reunion was emotional for everyone present. Dr. No. Di wept openly as she watched the lioness move, without pain or limitation. President Traoré stood in silent contemplation, seemingly overwhelmed by the successful outcome of their intervention. But the most remarkable moment came when the male lion approached the president once again, stopping just a few meters away. This time, there was no desperation in his posture, no plea for help. Instead, he seemed to be making a different kind of statement, an acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged between them. The lion sat on his haunches, a position that made him seem less imposing while maintaining his dignity. He looked directly at President Traoré for a long moment, then slowly lowered his head in what could only be interpreted as a bow of greeting. Not submission, but recognition between equals who had shared an extraordinary experience. President Traoré responded with his own slight bow, a gesture of respect that acknowledged the lion's sovereignty in his natural domain. The exchange lasted only a few seconds, but it was captured by Marcel's cameras and would become another iconic moment in the ongoing story of their unique relationship. "They remember," whispered Dr. Matambo, who was observing the behavior with fascination. "Not only do they remember the individuals who helped them, but they understand the significance of the relationship that was formed." The expedition established the wildlife preserve as planned, with the lion's territory at its heart. Advanced monitoring systems were installed that would track animal movements and detect any signs of poaching activity. Local communities were engaged as partners in the conservation effort, with many former poachers finding new livelihoods as park rangers and wildlife guides. As the day concluded and the expedition prepared to return to the capital, the lions remained visible at the edge of the clearing, watching the humans who had become such an important part of their story. It seemed to be their way of saying goodbye, not with the fear or aggression typically shown by wild animals toward human intruders, but with the acknowledgement shared between old friends. 1 year after the encounter that had captivated the world, President Traoré reflected on how a single moment of compassion had transformed not only his own life, but the lives of millions of people around the globe. The wildlife preserve established at the site of the rescue had become a model for conservation efforts throughout Africa, demonstrating that protection of natural habitats could coexist with economic development and community prosperity. The preserve had created over 200 jobs for local residents, from park rangers and guides to researchers and support staff. Tourism revenue had increased regional income by 300%, providing sustainable alternatives to poaching and other environmentally destructive activities. Most importantly, the wildlife population within the preserve had flourished, with several endangered species showing significant population growth. The lions themselves had become the preserve's most famous residents, though they remained wild and free. The pride had grown to include 2 cubs, born to the rescued lioness 8 months after her recovery. The presence of the young lions seemed to symbolize hope for the future and the success of the conservation efforts. Dr. NDA had established a wildlife medicine clinic at the preserve, treating injured animals and conducting research that contributed to conservation efforts throughout West Africa. Her work had gained international recognition, leading to partnerships with veterinary schools and research institutions around the world. That day changed my understanding of what it means to be a healer, she reflected during an interview at her clinic. When I treated that lioness, I wasn't just providing medical care. I was participating in a moment that bridged the gap between human and animal experience. It taught me that healing is about more than just medical expertise. It's about compassion, respect, and understanding. The story had also inspired a new generation of conservationists and leaders around the world. Schools named after President Traoré had been established on every continent, many with curricula focused on environmental stewardship and compassionate leadership. The Lion's Bow Scholarship program provided educational opportunities for young people committed to wildlife, conservation, and environmental protection. Marcel and Fatima's documentary about the rescue and its aftermath had won multiple international awards and had been translated into over 50 languages. The film not only documented the events themselves, but explored their deeper meaning for human-animal relationships and the future of conservation efforts worldwide. We knew we were witnessing something special while it was happening. Marcel reflected during the documentary's premiere in Ouagadougou. But we couldn't have imagined how far the ripples of that moment would spread or how many lives it would touch. The international community had also embraced the story's message of compassion and cooperation. The United Nations established the Lion's Courage Award for individuals and organizations demonstrating exceptional commitment to wildlife conservation and cross-species understanding. The first recipient was President Traoré himself, though he donated the monetary prize to establish additional wildlife preserves throughout West Africa. In scientific circles, the encounter had sparked new research into animal cognition and emotional intelligence. The male lion's ability to seek human help for his mate had challenged traditional assumptions about animal consciousness and problem-solving abilities. Studies of similar behaviors in other species began revealing a complex world of animal emotions and reasoning that science was only beginning to understand. Dr. Patricia Williamson, a cognitive ethologist at Oxford University, published a groundbreaking paper titled Interspecies Empathy: Lessons from the Burkina Faso Lion Rescue. Her research suggested that the capacity for empathy and cooperative behavior extended far beyond human society, existing as a fundamental characteristic of many intelligent species. The male lion's actions that day demonstrated sophisticated reasoning, emotional intelligence, and an understanding of cause and effect that we're still trying to fully comprehend, Dr. Williamson explained during a lecture at the Royal Geographic Society. He assessed his situation, identified potential allies, and successfully communicated his need across species barriers. This suggests levels of cognitive complexity that challenge our traditional understanding of animal minds. The story's influence extended far beyond conservation and science into the realm of human relationships and social change. Community leaders around the world began referencing the lion's example when addressing conflicts and promoting cooperation between different groups. The image of the powerful predator humbling himself to seek help became a symbol of strength through vulnerability and the courage required to ask for assistance. In South Africa, Nelson Mandela's grandson, Ndaba Mandela, incorporated the story into his speeches about reconciliation and unity. That lion showed us that there is no shame in asking for help when love is at stake, he told audiences during a tour of African universities. If the king of beasts can bow before others to save what matters most, then surely we can set aside our pride to build a better world for all. Religious leaders from multiple faiths found spiritual meaning in the encounter. The Vatican issued a statement praising President Traoré's compassionate response as an example of environmental stewardship, while Buddhist monks in Tibet saw the event as a demonstration of interconnectedness between all living beings. Islamic scholars in Cairo wrote extensively about the responsibility humans bear as stewards of Allah's creation, using the rescue as an example of righteous action. The story had particular resonance in educational settings. Teachers from elementary schools to universities used the encounter to discuss topics ranging from biology and environmental science to ethics and leadership. Children who learned about the brave lion and the compassionate president often went on to pursue careers in conservation, veterinary medicine, and environmental law, Sarah Chen, a veterinarian in Singapore who had been inspired by Dr. NDA's work, established a mobile wildlife clinic that served remote areas throughout Southeast Asia. Watching that footage as a teenager made me realize that healing animals wasn't just about medical knowledge, she explained while treating an injured orangutan in Borneo. It was about understanding the connections between all living things and acting with compassion, even when it requires courage. The preserve itself became a pilgrimage site for people, seeking inspiration and renewal. Visitors came not just to see wildlife, but to experience the place where such an extraordinary demonstration of interspecies cooperation had occurred. The guided tours, led by local community members, emphasized the ongoing conservation work while sharing the story of the rescue and its continuing impact. Among the most frequent visitors were other political leaders, many of whom sought to understand how President Traoré had managed to maintain such high approval ratings while pursuing policies that prioritized environmental protection over short-term economic gains. His approach had demonstrated that environmental leadership could be politically successful when coupled with genuine compassion and effective communication. 5 years after the rescue, the scientific community was still studying the implications of what had occurred in that savanna clearing. Research teams had established long-term monitoring programs not just for the famous lion pride, but for human-wildlife interactions throughout the region. The data they collected painted a fascinating picture of how one extraordinary event could influence an entire ecosystem. The preserve had become a living laboratory for studying animal behavior and conservation effectiveness. Motion-activated cameras throughout the territory documented thousands of hours of wildlife activity, revealing complex social structures and behavioral patterns that had never been observed before. The famous lion pair had become the subjects of one of the most comprehensive behavioral studies ever conducted on wild lions. Dr. James Kingsley, a behavioral ecologist from Cambridge University, had spent 3 years studying the pride's behavior patterns. His findings challenged many assumptions about wild animal psychology and social learning. What we've discovered is remarkable, Dr. Kingsley explained during a research presentation at the International Conference on Animal Behavior in Vienna. The male lion's initial approach to humans appears to have been learned behavior passed down to his offspring and other pride members. We've documented multiple instances of these lions approaching human researchers and conservationists in non-threatening ways, almost as if they understand that humans can be allies rather than threats. The implications extended beyond animal behavior into the realm of conservation strategy. Traditional approaches to wildlife protection had emphasized separation between human and animal populations, but the Burkina Faso model demonstrated that carefully managed interaction could benefit both species. The preserve's community-based conservation program had become a template for similar projects across Africa and beyond. Local communities were not just employed by the conservation effort, they were partners in its development and implementation. Former poachers had become some of the most effective wildlife protectors, using their intimate knowledge of animal behavior to enhance conservation efforts. Amadou Ouedraogo, a former poacher who had become one of the preserve's lead rangers, reflected on his transformation during an interview with National Geographic. "Before that day when the president saved the lioness, I saw animals only as sources of income," he admitted. But watching him risk his safety to free her from that trap, seeing how the male lion trusted him with the life of his mate, it changed how I understood the relationship between humans and animals. Now I use the same skills I once used to trap animals to protect them instead. The economic model developed at the preserve had proven sustainable and replicable. Tourism revenue, research partnerships, and international conservation funding had created a diverse income stream that reduced dependence on any single source. More importantly, the economic benefits flowed directly to local communities, creating strong incentives for continued conservation support. The story of the lion's plea had become embedded in the cultural consciousness of a generation that had grown up watching the footage on social media and learning about it in schools. These young people, now entering adulthood, brought with them a fundamentally different understanding of human-animal relationships and environmental responsibility, universities around the world reported. dramatic increases in enrollment for programs related to conservation biology, veterinary medicine, and environmental policy. Many students cited the Burkina Faso rescue as their inspiration for pursuing careers dedicated to wildlife protection and environmental stewardship. Maria Santos, a marine biology student at the University of São Paulo, had decorated her dormitory room with images from the rescue. When I was 12 years old, I watched that lion boat of President Traoré, and I knew I wanted to dedicate my life to protecting animals, she explained while preparing for a research expedition to study dolphin behavior off the Brazilian coast. That moment showed me that individual actions can have global impact, and that compassion can cross any barrier. The preserve had established an international internship program that brought young conservationists from around the world to work alongside local communities and researchers. These programs fostered cross-cultural understanding while building capacity for conservation work in participants' home countries. Among the most successful graduates of the program was Jennifer Nakamura, a Japanese-American student who had spent 6 months working at the preserve before returning to establish a wildlife rehabilitation center in California. Her center specialized in treating animals injured by human activity, drawing directly on the techniques and philosophy she had learned in Burkina Faso. The lion rescue taught us that healing isn't just about medical intervention, she explained while caring for an injured hawk at her facility. It's about understanding the relationships between all living things and taking responsibility for the impact of human actions on the natural world. Every animal we treat here carries forward that message of compassion and interconnection. The preserve's educational programs had expanded to include virtual reality experiences that allowed students around the world to visit the site of the rescue and observe the ongoing conservation work. These programs had reached over 10 million students globally, creating a shared understanding of conservation challenges and successes that transcended national and cultural boundaries. Dr. NDA had become a global ambassador for wildlife medicine, traveling to universities and research institutions to share her experiences and expertise. Her lectures consistently drew standing-room-only crowds, with students eager to learn not just about veterinary techniques, but about the philosophy of compassionate care that had guided her work since that transformative day in the savannah. 10 years after the rescue, President Traoré remained in office, having been re-elected twice with overwhelming majorities that reflected his continued popularity and effectiveness as a leader. His approach to governance, emphasizing environmental stewardship, community engagement, and compassionate decision-making, had transformed not only Burkina Faso, but influenced political movements throughout Africa and beyond. The preserve had grown into a network of protected areas covering over 50,000 hectares, supporting thriving populations of lions, elephants, leopards, and dozens of other species. The economic impact extended far beyond tourism, with sustainable agriculture, renewable energy projects, and educational initiatives creating thousands of jobs while maintaining ecological balance. The original lion pair, now elderly by wild standards, remained in their territory with an extended family that included children and grandchildren. Wildlife biologists had documented unprecedented longevity in the pride, attributing their success to the protected environment and the reduced stress from human threats. The male lion, now graying around his muzzle but still magnificent in bearing, had become something of a legend himself. Visitors to the preserve often hoped to catch a glimpse of the famous lion, though he remained wild and unpredictable. Rangers reported that he still showed unique behaviors around humans, occasionally approaching vehicles or research stations as if checking on the activities of his human neighbors. Marcel, now an internationally recognized wildlife filmmaker, had produced a series of documentaries following the pride over the years. His latest film, The Lion's Legacy, A Decade of Conservation, premiered simultaneously in theaters around the world and on streaming platforms, reaching an estimated audience of over 100 million viewers. 10 years ago, I thought I was just documenting a rescue, Marcel reflected during the film's premiere in Ouagadougou. I had no idea I was capturing the beginning of a movement that would change how humanity thinks. about its relationship with the natural world. Fatima had won the Pulitzer Prize for her reporting on the rescue and its aftermath, but she continued to work as a correspondent covering environmental and conservation stories throughout Africa. Her book, When Lions Bow Leadership, Compassion, and the Future of Conservation, had become required reading in political, science, and environmental studies programs. Worldwide, the Preserve's research station had become one of the most important centers for wildlife study in Africa, with scientists from around the world conducting research on topics ranging from animal cognition to ecosystem management. The data collected over a decade of study had contributed to conservation efforts on every continent and had fundamentally advanced scientific understanding of human-wildlife relationships. As President Traoré stood once again in the clearing where it all began, now marked by a simple stone monument commemorating the rescue, he reflected on the journey that had brought him and his nation to this moment. The afternoon light fell across the savannah in the same golden patterns that had illuminated that extraordinary day a decade earlier. But everything else had changed. The preserve thrived around him, filled with the sounds of healthy wildlife populations living without fear of poachers or habitat destruction. Communities that had once struggled with poverty now prospered as partners in conservation efforts. Young people who might have turned to illegal activities now found purpose and income in protecting the natural heritage of their homeland. But perhaps most importantly, the story of the lion's plea had planted seeds of compassion and understanding in millions of hearts around the world. Children who had grown up knowing the story approached their relationship with the natural world differently than previous generations. They understood intuitively that humans and animals shared the planet, and that cooperation rather than domination offered the path to a sustainable future. The lion taught us something we had forgotten, President Traoré said, speaking to a small gathering of conservationists and community leaders who had joined him for the 10th anniversary commemoration. He taught us that asking for help is not a sign of weakness but of wisdom. He showed us that love transcends species barriers and that compassion is the most powerful force in the natural world. As if summoned by his words, movement in the tall grass caught everyone's attention. The aging male lion emerged into the clearing, his mate beside him, followed by several of their offspring and grandchildren. The pride had grown and prospered over the decade, but the original pair remained its heart and soul. The old lion looked across the clearing at the gathered humans, his golden eyes still bright despite his age. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, predator and president regarded each other with mutual respect and recognition. Then, as he had done so many times before, the lion lowered his massive head in acknowledgement of the bond that connected them. President Traoré bowed in return, a gesture of respect that honored not just the individual animal, but everything he represented, the wildness that must be preserved, the love that motivates all living things, and the courage required to ask for help when help is needed. As the sun set over the preserve, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, the lions disappeared back into the grass, returning to their wild lives while carrying with them the knowledge that they lived in a world where humans could be allies rather than enemies. The story that had begun with a desperate plea in the wilderness had become something larger than anyone could have imagined, a testament to the power of compassion to transform the world one heart at a time. And as new generations learned the tale of the lion who bowed before a president and the president who answered with courage, the lesson continued to spread, ensuring that the bonds forged in that moment of crisis would endure for generations to come. In the end, the greatest lesson of the lion's plea was not about wildlife conservation or political leadership, though it had transformed both. It was about the fundamental truth that connects all living beings, that love, courage, and compassion are the forces that make life not just possible, but meaningful. And that when we respond to the needs of others, whether human or animal, with open hearts and brave actions, we create a world where miracles become possible and hope becomes reality. The stars emerged in the darkening sky above the preserve, their light falling on a landscape where the ancient relationship between human and animal had been renewed and transformed. And somewhere in the tall grass, a lion and his mate rested peacefully, secure in the knowledge that love had indeed conquered all, and that the world was a little kinder because of their courage to ask for help when help was needed most. The end. This story of compassion, courage, and the bonds that unite all living beings serves as a reminder that individual actions can have global impact, and that sometimes the most powerful moments arise when we have the wisdom to ask for help and the courage to provide it.